Hello, listener. If this signal is punching through the static, it means the grid hasn't completely corroded yet. Or maybe you've got a receiver strong enough to pull a ghost out of the airwaves. If you're new to this frequency, keep the volume low. Sound travels differently now. The rain carries it. It amplifies it. And if you're close to the water, sound is adjusted dinner bell. My name is Silas Vance. I'm currently broadcasting from the control house of the Iron Point Bascule Bridge, suspended roughly 140 feet above the Black River. People used to look at this bridge and just see a way to get to work. They saw 4 lanes of asphalt, steel girders, and traffic jams. They didn't see the machine. They didn't see the massive concrete counterweights hanging inside the piers, or the trunnion bearings the size of a minivan that allow a 3,000-ton leaf of steel to tilt toward the sky like it weighs nothing. I see the machine. I live inside the machine. For the last 40 days, I've been the sole occupant of the operator's tower. It's a reinforced glass and concrete box, about 20 feet by 20 feet, perched directly over the navigation channel. Below me is the river, swollen and angry, churning with debris and things that used to be people. On either side of me are the 2 leaves of the bridge, raised to a 70-degree angle. They aren't just raised to let ships pass anymore. They're raised because that 70-degree incline is the only thing keeping the city from walking up here and eating me alive. This isn't a story about saving the world or finding a cure. The world is too wet to save. This is a story about leverage, hydraulics, and learning how to live in a glass cage without throwing stones. Let's go back to the start, before the rain became permanent, before the weep turned the population into something slippery and wrong. I was a bridge tender. It's one of those invisible jobs that keeps civilization running. You drink your coffee, you log the barge traffic, you listen to the marine radio, and you push buttons. It's 99% boredom and 1% panic. The Iron Point is a double-leaf bascule bridge. That means it splits in the middle and opens upward, like 2 jaws yawning at the clouds. My office, the control house, sits on the north arch, high above the roadway. The decline was slow, then instantaneous. That's usually how mechanics fail too. A bearing grinds for weeks, you ignore the heat signature, and then snap, the whole assembly shears off. The news called it a tropical hydrological event, a storm system that stalled over the coast and just refused to move. It rained for 6 days straight, not a drizzle, but a hammering tropical sheet of water. The drainage systems backed up within 48 hours. Basements flooded, the subways became aqueducts, and then the water started making people sick. The first symptoms looked like hypothermia, pale skin, shivering, a desperate thirst. But then the skin started to sheen. It looked like they were covered in a layer of oil or mucus. They stopped speaking, they stopped blinking, and they started seeking out water. I was on shift when the evacuation order finally came through. It was a Tuesday, 4 a.m. The rain was drumming against the slanted windows of the tower so hard I couldn't see the shoreline lights. The marine radio, usually full of tugboat captains cursing about currents, had gone dead silent hours ago. My supervisor, a guy named Miller who managed the bridge authority from a dry office 10 miles inland, called the landline. The connection was fuzzy, crackling with static. "Silas," he said. His voice was tight, high-pitched. "Silas, we're diverting traffic. The tunnels are flooded. The Iron Point is the only route out of the downtown sector. You need to lock the brakes. Do not, under any circumstances, lift the spans. Do you copy? The bridge stays down." I told him I copied. I hung up the phone. I looked out at the monitor bank. The cameras showed the approach roads. It was a sea of red taillights. Thousands of cars, bumper to bumper, crawling toward me from the city side. They were trying to cross over to the mainland, away from the rising floodwaters. From my elevation, it looked like a glowing river of lava. But if you looked closer, at the high-definition feeds, you saw the panic. People were abandoning cars in the breakdown lanes. They were running between the vehicles. And there were shapes moving in the shadows of the rain. Dark, slick shapes that moved with a terrifying fluidity. The slicks, that's what I call them now, the infected. I watched a family sedan near the toll booth, about a quarter mile from my tower, get swarmed. It didn't look like a fight. It looked like a wave crashing over a rock. 3 figures, glistening wet under the sodium streetlights, just slid over the hood and smashed the windshield with their foreheads. They didn't seem to feel pain. They dragged the driver out. I turned the monitor off. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the kind designed for 12-hour shifts, and I watched the rain streak the glass. I had a decision to make. The bridge was the lifeline. If I kept it down, the traffic would keep flowing. Maybe some people would make it. Maybe the National Guard would show up. But then I saw the truck. It was a tanker, a fuel hauler, jackknifed across all 3 lanes right at the base of the bridge on the city side. The traffic stopped dead. The horns started blaring, a constant, dissonant chord of frustration that rose up through the steel girders and vibrated the floor of my tower. The deadlock trapped hundreds of cars on the bridge span itself. Families, truckers, commuters. And behind them, coming up the on-ramp, was the infection. The slicks don't run, they flow. They move low to the ground using the rain to slide. I saw them hitting the back of the traffic jam. It was a slaughter. And the problem with a bridge is that it's a funnel. There's nowhere to go but forward, and forward was blocked by 20 tons of jackknifed steel. That's when the logic of the engineer took over. I wasn't a soldier. I couldn't go down there and shoot my way to safety. I had a wrench, a thermos of coffee, and a control panel that operated 6 million pounds of counterweighted steel. If I stayed on the ground level, or if I let them cross, the tower would eventually be overrun. The slicks can climb. I'd seen them scale the toll booth walls like geckos, sticky, wet, relentless. But the Iron Point had a defense mechanism built into its design. The control house isn't just a room, it's a separate structure located on the trunnion pier. If I raised the bridge, the roadway would tilt up, creating a 70-degree wall of asphalt. It would sever the connection to the city. It would also sever the connection to the mainland. It would turn the bridge into an island, and it would turn my tower into a penthouse suite in hell. I looked at the console. The span fully seated light was glowing a steady, reassuring green. The lock's engaged light was green. I grabbed the master key from around my neck. My hands weren't shaking. That's the funny thing about extreme pressure. Sometimes the shakes don't come until later. In the moment, everything feels hyper-real, cold, mathematical. I inserted the key and turned it to maintenance override. This bypassed the traffic gates. I couldn't wait for the gates to come down. There was no traffic to stop. The traffic was already here. I grabbed the PA system microphone. I don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to feel like a human being one last time. I pressed the button. My voice boomed out over the rain-soaked deck, echoing off the steel trusswork. Clear the center span. I repeat, clear the movable span. The bridge is raising. This is not a drill. Get off the movable span. Nobody heard me, or if they did, they couldn't move. The cars were packed door to door. I hesitated for 3 seconds. Then I saw a slick, a big one, maybe a former linebacker, skin gray and glistening, haul itself up the side of the bridge railing directly below me. It looked up at the tower. Its eyes were milky white, diluted by the rain. It opened its mouth and let out a sound like a clogged drain gurgling. That was the catalyst. I hit the span unlock button. A massive metallic thunk reverberated through the soles of my boots. That was the huge steel tongues disengaging from the toe of the bridge. Then I pushed the main levers forward. Hoist. The electric motors are housed 2 floors below me in the machinery room. They actuate the reduction gears, gears the size of dinner tables, which turn the pinion shafts. When those motors kicked in, the lights in the tower dimmed for a second. The deep, guttural groan of the machinery drowned out the storm. It was a sound of immense power, torque against gravity. The floor tilted. Not my floor, the tower is stationary, but the world outside my window shifted. The bridge deck began to separate. On the monitors, I watched the horror. The cars parked on the toe of the bridge, the part that splits, started to slide. Gravity is impartial. It doesn't care if you're a good person or a bad person. It just cares about the coefficient of friction. As the angle increased to 10 degrees, then 20, the cars lost their grip on the wet asphalt. They slid backwards, crashing into the vehicles behind them. It was a slow-motion avalanche of steel and glass. Some vehicles turned sideways and rolled. The screaming. I can still hear the screaming if I let the room get too quiet. That's why I keep the fans running. But as the bridge rose, it created a chasm. A chasm. The slicks that were rushing the span reached the edge of the rising leaf and tumbled into the black water below. They didn't scream. They just splashed and sank. I kept the lever pushed forward until the indicators read 70 degrees. Then I centered the controls and hit brake set. The massive air brakes hissed. The gears locked. The bridge froze in place. Two giant steel monoliths pointing at the storm clouds, creating an impassable barrier on both sides of my tower. I was safe. But I was also trapped. The control house sits on the fixed pier. To get to land, I have to walk down a catwalk onto the bridge deck and walk to shore. But now, the bridge deck was a vertical wall. I had effectively cut the cords. I stood there at the window, looking down. The roadway below the movable span was empty now. The cars had slid off or been crushed against the barrier gates at the bottom. The slicks were gathered at the edge of the abyss on the city side, staring across the gap. They couldn't jump 100 feet. They couldn't climb a vertical steel grate covered in rain. I watched them for an hour. They just stood there, vibrating, soaking up the rain. Night fell properly then. The city grid failed in sectors. First, the suburbs went dark, then the port. The only light came from the lightning flashes and the emergency strobes of abandoned police cruisers. Inside the tower, the silence returned. The motors had stopped. The screaming had stopped. It was just me, the hum of the instrument panel, and the rain. Always the rain. I took stock of my inventory. This is the part that matters. Panic kills, but starvation kills slower and crueler. The control house is designed for comfort, but not habitation. I had a mini fridge, contents, 2 turkey sandwiches, stale, 3 energy drinks, a half-gallon of milk that expired yesterday, and a jar of jalapenos. I had the water cooler, 5 gallons, plus 1 spare bottle in the corner, 10 gallons total. I had the bathroom, functional plumbing drawing from a tank in the pier, but discharging directly into the river. I had my tool bag, standard issue bridge tender kit, multimeters, heavy-duty wrenches, screwdrivers, flashlights, lockout-tagout locks, and a utility knife. And crucially, I had the generator. The bridge has a backup diesel generator the size of a pickup truck located in the machinery room below. It feeds off a distinct fuel tank, separate from the grid. According to the gauge on my console, the tank was at 85%. If I ran it only for essentials, lights, heat, pumps, I calculated I had about 4 months of power. The bridge consists of the movable spans and the fixed spans, the approach roads. When I raised the bridge, I didn't just create a wall, I created a shelf. On the mainland side of the lift, the side opposite the city, there was a section of the bridge deck that was technically part of the movable leaf, but because of the way the cars had jammed, a cluster of about 6 vehicles had managed to stay pinned against the railing near the trunnion post. They hadn't slid off. They were wedged there. A delivery truck, 2 sedans, a contractor's van. Those weren't cars anymore. They were supply crates. If I could figure out a way to get out of the tower, navigate the icy, greased-up steel grating of the machinery deck, and rappel down to those vehicles without slipping into the river, I could loot them. I sat on the floor with my back against the radiator. The glass walls of the tower felt thin. Every time lightning flashed, I saw the silhouettes of the raised bridge leaves looming over me like tombstones. The first night is the hardest because your brain is still trying to reject the new reality. You keep waiting for the phone to ring. You keep waiting for the sirens to sound organized rather than chaotic. At 2 a.m., I heard a thud against the glass. I jumped, grabbing the heavy brass flashlight from the desk. I shined it at the window. It wasn't a slick. It was a seagull, but it wasn't right. Its feathers were matted with that gray slime. It pecked at the glass, once, twice, with a manic intensity, leaving smears of oily residue. Then it convulsed and fell off the ledge, plummeting into the dark water below. That was the moment I realized the biological containment of the tower was my #1 priority. The slicks were the obvious threat, but the rain itself, the weep, was the delivery system. If I let that water inside, if I breathed in the mold that grew from it, I was dead. I grabbed a roll of duct tape from the maintenance drawer. I spent the next 3 hours taping every seam of the windows. I taped over the gap under the heavy steel door. I taped over the vents, leaving only the filtered intake for the HVAC system. I turned the thermostat up to 80 degrees. Fungi hate dry heat. I was going to bake this tower until it was the driest place on Earth. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the operator's chair, watching the monitors that still had power. The city across the river was burning in patches now, fire struggling against the rain. I saw movement on the catwalk below, the maintenance walkway that runs along the side of the bridge gear set. I froze. A slick had managed to crawl along the underside of the girder before I raised the span. It was trapped on the pier with me. It was wandering in circles around the machinery room door. I looked at the door to my tower. It was solid steel, locked from the inside. But the machinery room, 2 floors down, is where the generator is. It's where the fuel is. It's where the tools are. If that thing was down there, I was cut off from my lungs and my heart. I picked up the utility knife. It felt ridiculously small in my hand. I looked at the wrench, a 24-inch pipe wrench, cast iron, heavy enough to crack a skull. This is where the story shifts. It stops being about traffic control and starts being about territory. I had claimed the high ground. I had raised the drawbridge, but now I had to clear the castle. I checked the seals on my boots. I pulled my hood up. I grabbed the wrench. Morning was coming, a gray, miserable dawn that offered no warmth. I had to go down into the gear room. I had to clear the perimeter, because if I didn't, the noise of the generator would eventually drive that thing into a frenzy, and it would find a way to break something I couldn't fix. I unlocked the tower door. The sound of the rain was deafening, a roar of white noise. The air smelled of rot and wet copper. I stepped out onto the metal grating of the landing. The rule of the bridge is simple. Gravity wins. My job was to make sure it won for me and not for the thing waiting in the dark below. Stepping out of the control house was like stepping into a car wash set to flay. The wind up here, 140 feet above the water, doesn't blow, it shoves. It grabbed the door and tried to rip the hinges off. I had to lean my entire body weight against the steel just to get it latched behind me. I was now on the upper machinery catwalk. To my left, the sheer drop to the black churning river. To my right, the massive steel wall of the control house. And directly ahead, about 30 feet down the walkway near the stairwell to the generator room, was the intruder, the slick. It had stopped pacing. It was standing perfectly still, face pressed against the handrail, looking down at the water. That's the thing about the weep. It makes them catatonic until they sense biology. I gripped the pipe wrench with both hands. My gloves were wet instantly. Wet gloves on cold iron means zero friction. I wiped my palms on my trousers, a useless gesture, and took a step. Clang. The steel grating of the catwalk is designed to let snow fall through, but it amplifies footsteps like a drum. The figure snapped its head around. Up close, the infection looked worse than on the monitors. The man, it used to be a man, maybe a dock worker based on the shredded neon vest, was coated in a translucent gray film. It looked like he had been dipped in glycerin. Raindrops didn't roll off him, they seemed to absorb into the layer. He let out that sound again, a wet, rattling hiss, like air bubbling through sludge. He didn't run, he flowed. He dropped to all fours and scrambled along the railing with a speed that defied the slick metal. I didn't have a plan beyond hit it. Bridge tenders aren't trained for hand-to-hand combat. We're trained to grease bearings and log shift times. He lunged. I swung the wrench. It was a clumsy, terrified arc. I missed his head but caught his shoulder. It didn't make a crunching sound like bone breaking. It made a wet thud like hitting a bag of wet cement. The impact jarred my arms up to the elbows, but it stopped his momentum. He sprawled onto the grating, his limbs flailing, trying to find purchase. This is where the environment kills you. The catwalk is narrow, barely 3 feet wide. He swiped at my ankle. His hand was cold, impossibly cold. It's sticky. It adhered to my boot leather for a second before I kicked him free. That adhesion terrified me more than the violence. If he grabbed skin, he wouldn't just hold on, he would fuse. I stepped back, raising the wrench for a killing blow, but then I looked at the railing. The iron point is a machine, and the first rule of mechanics is you don't fight force with force, you change the vector. He was scrambling up, his feet slipping on the wet grate. He was unbalanced. I didn't swing the wrench at him, I swung it at the railing he was using to pull himself up. The metal rang out, a sharp, piercing bell tone that cut through the storm. The vibration startled him. He flinched, his grip loosening on the wet steel. I stepped in and kicked him, a straight piston-like kick to the center of his chest. He went backward. He hit the top rail, tipped over the center of gravity, and fell. There was no scream, just the visual of his limbs windmilling in the gray air, smaller and smaller, until he hit the black river. A splash, instantly swallowed by the current. I stood there, hyperventilating, the wrench shaking in my hand. I looked at my boot where he had touched it, a smear of gray slime. I scraped it off against the serrated edge of the grating until the leather was raw. One down, but the castle wasn't clear yet. I moved to the stairwell. The door to the machinery room was unlatched. That's how he got up. I descended the metal steps, the noise of the storm dampening as I went deeper into the concrete pier structure. The machinery room is the heart of the bridge. It's a cavernous space, dominated by the massive bull gears, steel wheels 20 feet in diameter, and the 2 main drive motors. It smells of diesel, grease, and ozone. I swept the room with my flashlight beam. Shadows danced behind the gears, but nothing moved. I checked the corners. Clear. I checked the maintenance cage. Clear. I went straight to the generator. The Cummins diesel engine was humming along in low idle mode. I checked the day tank. Fuel lines were intact, no leaks. Then I checked the supply locker in the corner. This was the jackpot I was praying for. The Bridge Authority takes safety seriously. In that locker, I found 3 boxes of N95 respirators, a box of nitrile gloves, and 2 Tyvek chemical suits, the white hooded coveralls painters use. I almost cried. It wasn't food, but it was a barrier. I stripped off my wet jacket right there, put on a Tyvek suit, zipped it to the chin, and pulled a mask over my face. I looked like a forensic tech at a crime scene, but for the first time in 24 hours, I felt clean. I did a full inventory of the room. 50 gallons of distilled water for the batteries, drinkable if boiled. A case of industrial paper towels, a first aid kit, basic but band-aids and antiseptic, and a flare gun with 4 shells. I took the flare gun. I don't know who I planned to signal, but having a projectile weapon felt better than a wrench. I locked the machinery room door from the inside, deadbolting it. The only way in now was the key I had in my pocket. I climbed back up to the tower, the Tyvek suit rustling loudly in the quiet stairwell. Back in the glass box, the adrenaline crash hit me like a sedative. My hands started shaking. I sat in the operator's chair and stared at the monitors. Hunger is a sharp pain at first, but after a day it turns into a dull, heavy ache in your gut. My 2 turkey sandwiches were gone. The milk was gone. I looked out the south window toward the raised span on the mainland side. The rain had let up slightly, turning into a persistent, heavy drizzle. Through the mist, I could see them, the supply crates. Wedged against the pedestrian railing, about 30 feet up the incline of the raised bridge leaf, were the vehicles. A white panel van marked Tri-State Electrical, a dark blue sedan, a silver SUV. They were resting on a 70-degree slope, held in place only by the friction of their tires against the asphalt and the flimsy aluminum railing they were crushed against. If that railing gave way, they would plummet 100 feet onto the concrete pier below or bounce into the river. I needed what was inside them. But getting to them was a physics problem. I couldn't walk up the bridge deck. It was too steep and too slick with the weep. I had to drop down from above. The iron point has a counterweight pit, a massive hole beneath the road deck where the concrete weights swing down when the bridge opens. Right now, the bridge was open, so the weights were down in the pit. That meant the structural girders above the pit were exposed. I spent the next hour rigging. I took a spool of half-inch static line, rope used for bridge inspections, and tied a high-strength anchor knot around the main trunnion column. I clipped in with a climbing harness I found in the safety kit. I grabbed a canvas tool bucket and clipped it to my belt. This was madness. I knew it was madness, but the alternative was starving in a glass box while watching the world rot. I stepped out onto the catwalk again. The wind had shifted, blowing from the north now, colder. I climbed over the railing of the catwalk and onto the structural steel of the open bridge leaf. This is hard to visualize if you haven't been on a bridge. Imagine climbing the skeleton of a skyscraper that is tilted sideways. I was crawling on the underside of the roadway. Below me, through the gaps in the steel lattice, was the river. I reached the point directly above the white electrical van. I double-checked my carabiners. I took a breath of the damp, moldy air through my mask, and I lowered myself. Rappelling in a storm is awful. The wind catches you and spins you. I bumped against a steel crossbrace, bruising my thigh, but I kept descending. My boots touched the roof of the van. It shifted. I froze. The van groaned. The suspension creaked. It was perched precariously. If I added too much dynamic weight, I could send the whole thing sliding. I gently transferred my weight from the rope to the van's roof, keeping the line taut so I wasn't fully committing gravity to the vehicle. I slid down the windshield to the passenger door. It was locked. Of course it was locked. I used the window punch on my utility tool. Snap! The glass shattered. I cleared the shards and unlocked the door. I leaned inside. The smell hit me first. Stale coffee, cigarettes, and old sweat. It smelled like the old world. I rifled through the glove box. Maps, fuses, a tire gauge. Useless. I crawled over the center console into the back. It was a work van. Wire spools, conduit fittings, a drill case. And then I saw it. A cooler. A hard plastic lunch cooler wedged between a spool of wire and the wheel well. I opened it. 2 apples, bruised but intact, a bag of chips, and a thermos. I shook the thermos. Liquid. I put the food in my canvas bucket. I kept searching. In a crate of random hardware, I found a box of contractor-grade trash bags and a roll of duct tape. I took those too. You can never have enough waterproofing. I climbed out of the van. I looked at the blue sedan next to it. It was wedged slightly lower, its rear bumper hanging over empty space. I swung over to it. The wind gusted, pushing me away, then swinging me back hard. My boots slammed into the sedan's door. The car lurched downward 3 inches with a screech of tires on wet asphalt. My heart hammered against my ribs. I waited. It held. I smashed the rear window. The back seat was full of groceries, the panic buying. I saw bags from a wholesale club, canned soup, boxes of pasta, a flat of water bottles. I started grabbing cans, stuffing them into a bucket until it was heavy. And then I looked into the front seat. There was a driver, a woman. She was strapped in her seatbelt, her head resting against the steering wheel. She wasn't moving. I shined my light on her. She wasn't a slick. There was no gray film. Her skin was blue, pale. She had slit her wrists. A box cutter lay on the passenger seat. She had chosen the exit. I stared at her for a long time. The rain dripped into the broken window, pooling on her shoulder. I felt like a grave robber. I was a grave robber. "I'm sorry," I whispered inside my mask. "I'm sorry." I grabbed a few more cans of soup. I couldn't take the water flat. It was too heavy. I'd have to come back for it. The ascent was harder than the descent. Hauling 50 pounds of canned goods and tools up a vertical rope while wearing a Tyvek suit is a workout that burns calories I didn't have to spare. My arms burned. The wind tried to peel me off the rope, but I focused on the rhythm. Pull, lock, step. Pull, lock, step. When I finally flopped back onto the catwalk, I lay there for 5 minutes, just breathing. I dragged the bucket inside the control house and locked the door. I went through the decontamination ritual I had invented in my head. Spray the boots with a bleach solution I found under the sink. Peel off the Tyvek suit without touching the outside. Bag the suit. Wash hands with the last of the dish soap. Only then did I look at the haul. 6 cans of chunky soup, 2 cans of peaches, a box of crackers, soggy cardboard, but the inner bag was sealed. The apples, the thermos. I opened the thermos. It was coffee, cold, black, bitter coffee. I drank a cup. It tasted like victory. I sat there, eating a can of peaches with a screwdriver because I couldn't find a spoon, watching the rain batter the glass. I had secured a perimeter. I had secured food. I was alive. But then, something caught my eye on the monitors. I had 6 screens. 4 were static. 1 showed the approach road, empty and wet. The 6th screen showed the south tower, the twin to my tower on the other side of the lift span. The Iron Point has 2 towers, but usually only the north tower, mine, is manned. The south tower is a slave unit, housing machinery but no operator. There was a light in the south tower window. Not a reflection, a light. It blinked. Long, short, short, long. Morse code? No, it was rhythmic but erratic. I grabbed the binoculars. Through the rain and the gloom, across the 200 feet of open air between the raised bridge leaves, I focused on the south tower control room. The glass over there was dark, mostly, but someone or something was moving inside with a flashlight. The beam swung across the window, and for a split second, it illuminated the glass from the inside. The window was covered in handprints, gray, greasy smears, hundreds of them, pressing against the glass. And in the center of the room, illuminated by the erratic beam, a figure was standing at the console. It was wearing a bridge authority uniform. It looked up. It looked directly across the chasm at me. And then, the lights in my tower flickered. The south tower houses the electrical substations for the entire grid link. If something was in there, it had its hands on the breaker panel. My radio crackled. Not static this time. A voice. Wet, gurgling, but distinctly human. Bridge tender. The voice on the radio wasn't just a sound. It was a violation. For 40 days, I had categorized the slicks as biological debris. Dangerous, sure, like a mudslide or a downed power line, but mindless. They were inputs and outputs. Input, water. Output, violence. But that voice, bridge, tender, it had intonation. It had a cadence. It sounded wet, like speaking through a throat full of gelatin, but the cognitive spark was there. I grabbed the handset. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. The training manual says, establish communication, verify intent. But the training manual didn't account for the guy on the other end being dead for 3 weeks. Identify, I said. My voice was flat. I forced it to be flat. If you show fear to a predator, you trigger the chase reflex. If you show emotion to a machine, you waste data. I treated this like a machine. The radio crackled. "Silas," the voice gurgled. "It's cold in here. Open the gate. Let us cross." I froze. I knew that voice. Distorted, ruined, stripped of its usual bureaucratic impatience, but I knew it. "Miller?" I whispered. Miller, my supervisor, the man who had called me from his dry office inland, the man who ordered me to lock the brakes. He wasn't inland anymore. He was in the South Tower, 200 feet across the river channel. "The water," Miller said, his voice gaining a terrifying clarity. "It wants to flow. You are the dam, Silas. Break the dam." "I'm not opening the bridge, Miller," I said, leaning into the console. "If you're in the South Tower, you need to stay put." Are you sick?" A laugh came through the speaker, a wet, slapping sound. "We aren't sick. We are soluble." Then the lights in my tower died. It wasn't a flicker this time. It was a hard cut. The overhead fluorescence popped off. The hum of the ventilation system, the fans that were keeping the air dry and positive pressured, spooled down into silence. The only light came from the instrument panel's emergency LEDs and the lightning flashing outside. "Miller," I shouted into the handset, "turn it back on! You're killing the containment!" Dead air. I dropped the mic and scrambled to the breaker panel on the back wall. The main feed from the grid was dead. That was expected. But the feed from the South Tower substation, the line that connects our two structures, was tripped manually. He had pulled the master disconnect. I wasn't in the dark, though. My generator, the diesel beast in the machinery room below, was still running. I could feel its vibration in the floor. But the transfer switch hadn't kicked over automatically because the South Tower controls the logic board. I had to force it. I grabbed the emergency flashlight and popped the panel cover on the local override. I slammed the heavy lever from remote to isolated. Thud. The lights flickered back on. The fans groaned back to life. I exhaled, wiping sweat from my forehead. I had power. I was an island. But then I looked at the fuel gauge. The Iron Point's power system is designed for redundancy, but it has a flaw. The main fuel tanks, two 10,000-gallon reservoirs, are located on the south pier, where there is actual ground access for tanker trucks. The north pier, my pier, is essentially a concrete caisson standing in the water. We have a day tank, a smaller 500-gallon tank that feeds the generator directly. I looked at the fuel transfer status light. Red. Flow restricted. I tapped the gauge. The needle hovered at 80%. I did the math in my head instantly. The Cummins engine burns about 5 gallons an hour under load. I had 400 gallons roughly. 80 hours. 3 days. In 3 days, the generator dies. When the generator dies, the heater dies. When the heater dies, the humidity inside the tower matches the humidity outside, 100%. And then the mold starts. I've seen what it does to drywall in an afternoon. I've seen what it does to skin. Without the dry heat, I would be breathing spores within 12 hours of the blackout. Miller wasn't asking me to open the bridge anymore. He was putting me on a timer. I sat in the chair and stared out the rain-streaked window at the South Tower. It was a dark monolith in the storm. I couldn't see him anymore, but I knew he was watching. The slicks weren't mindless zombies. They were a hive. They understood infrastructure. They understood leverage. And they had just put me in checkmate. I had to restore the fuel flow. To do that, I had to manually open the valve on the South Pier. But how do you cross a 200-foot gap of open air over a raging river when the bridge is stuck in the up position? I looked at the schematics on the wall. Option A, the river. Swim? Suicide. The current was pushing 10 knots, and the water was toxic sludge. Option B, the utility tunnel. There's a service tunnel running under the riverbed for cables and pipes, but the flood sensors indicated it was filled with water. If I went down there, I'd be swimming in the dark with the things that live in the drain. Option C, the air. I looked at the bridge structure itself. The iron point is a bascule bridge, 2 leaves, or bascules, that pivot upward. Right now, they were both raised to 70 degrees. They stood like 2 massive steel ramps pointing at the sky. At the very top of each leaf, the toe, there are interlocking steel jaws called the span locks. When the bridge is down, these jaws lock the 2 halves together so cars can drive over. When the bridge is up, like it is now, the tips of the leaves are separated by a gap. I grabbed the binoculars and focused on the tips of the raised spans. Usually, when fully open, the gap is wide, maybe 50 feet. But I hadn't opened the bridge to the full vertical stop. I had stopped at 70 degrees to create the barricade. At 70 degrees, the 2 tips of the bridge leaves lean toward each other. I focused the lenses. The rain blurred the image, but I could see the gap. It looked to be about 20 feet. 20 feet of empty air, 150 feet above the water. If I could climb up the roadway of my leaf, climb the vertical asphalt ramp to the very top, I would be 20 feet away from the tip of the south leaf. And if I could get across that 20 feet, I could climb down the south leaf, reach the south tower, and kill the power to the slicks. It was a plan born of desperation and exhaustion. It was a plan that required me to become an alpinist on a structure covered in industrial grease and slime. But I had 3 days of fuel. Waiting was death. I spent the next 6 hours preparing. I turned the tower into a workshop. First, traction. My boots were standard issue safety toe. Good for dropping a hammer on your foot, bad for climbing a wet 70-degree slope. I took the screws out of the office door hinges. I found a cordless drill in my tool bag. I sat on the floor and drove 6 sharp screws through the sole of each boot from the inside out. I taped over the heads inside the boot so they wouldn't shred my feet. Now I had crampons, spikes that would bite into the asphalt. Second, the crossing. 20 feet is too far to jump. I needed a bridge. I looked at the aluminum extension ladder mounted on the wall of the machinery room below. It was 24 feet fully extended. 24 feet of ladder for a 20-foot gap. That gave me 2 feet of overlap on each side. 2 feet of margin between life and a long fall into the black water. I dragged the ladder up the stairs. It was awkward, banging against the railings. I lashed it to my backpack frame, a crude rig made of duct tape and straps. It stuck up 5 feet above my head and dragged behind me. Third, the weapon. I checked the flare gun. 4 shells. It wasn't enough to fight a horde, but it was enough to burn Miller if he tried to stop me. Finally, the suit. I put the Tyvek back on. I taped the seams again. I taped my gloves to my sleeves. I taped my pants to my boots. I was a sealed unit. I ate 1 can of cold, chunky soup. I drank half a bottle of water. I looked at the radio. I wanted to say something cool, something defiant, but I just turned the volume knob all the way down. I didn't want to hear him breathing while I climbed. I stepped out onto the catwalk. The storm had intensified. The rain was coming in sideways sheets now, stinging like hail. I clipped my safety harness to the static line I had rigged earlier. I climbed over the railing and onto the bridge deck itself. Standing on the roadway of a raised drawbridge is a disorienting experience. The road doesn't go forward, it goes up. It looked like a highway to heaven if heaven was made of wet asphalt and yellow lane markers. I tested my boots. Crunch. The screws bit into the road surface. Grip. I started to climb. It wasn't like climbing a ladder. It was a slow, agonizing crawl. Hands on the center line reflectors, boots stomping to drive the spikes in. The wind tried to peel the ladder off my back, turning me into a kite. I had to stay low, chest to the pavement. Every 20 feet, I clipped my safety lanyard to a scupper drain or a railing post. 50 feet up, I passed the supply crates, the cars I had looted earlier. They were groaning in the wind, shifting slightly. I gave them a wide berth. If one of them broke loose, it would slide down and crush me like a bug. 100 feet up. The air was thinner here, colder. The wind was ferocious. I could feel the whole massive steel leaf swaying. Bridges are designed to flex, but feeling the ground move beneath you induces a primal nausea. I looked down. Bad idea. The control house looked like a toy box. The river was just a roiling black vein. I looked up. The tip of the bridge, the toe, was jagged against the gray sky. I kept climbing. My quads were burning. My breath fogged my mask. I reached the top. The span locks are massive steel jaws, the size of a car engine, coated in heavy grease. I hooked my arm around one of the locking pins to anchor myself. I looked across the gap. The south leaf was right there. I could see the matching yellow line on the other side. I could see the rivets. But the gap, it wasn't 20 feet. Optical illusions are dangerous things. From the tower, with the foreshortening of the binoculars, it looked like 20. Up here, staring into the void, it looked like 25, maybe 30. I unstrapped the ladder. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. If I dropped it, the game was over. I extended the ladder to its maximum length. The aluminum clattered against the steel. The wind caught it, whipping it around. I braced the bottom feet of the ladder against the heavy steel housing of the span lock on my side. I held the ladder vertical like a mast. Okay, I yelled into the wind. Okay. I had to lower it across the gap like a drawbridge. I let it tip forward. Gravity took it. It fell in slow motion. I watched the top rung arc down toward the south leaf. Please be long enough. Please be long enough. Clang! The top of the ladder slammed onto the steel lip of the south leaf. It hit hard. It bounced. My heart stopped. It settled. I looked at the overlap. 6 inches. 6 inches of aluminum resting on wet, slippery steel on the far side. On my side, I had it wedged against the lock housing so it couldn't slide back. But if the bridge swayed, if the wind gusted, that 6 inches could become 0 inches instantly. I stared at the makeshift bridge, an aluminum ladder, horizontal, spanning a 30-foot drop into nothingness, connecting 2 swaying towers of steel. I had to crawl across it. I couldn't clip into anything. My safety lanyard wasn't long enough to reach the other side. I would have to unclip, crawl, and pray. I checked the flare gun in my pocket. I checked the knife. I unclipped my safety line from the north leaf. I was untethered. I got down on my hands and knees. I grabbed the side rails of the ladder. The aluminum was icy. I put one knee on the first rung. The ladder bowed under my weight. It was rated for 250 pounds. With my gear, I was pushing 230. I crawled. The wind howled through the rungs. I stared fixedly at the yellow paint on the far side. Don't look down. Look at the destination. Halfway across, the ladder was bouncing now, a harmonic oscillation caused by my movement in the wind, up and down, up and down. I stopped to let it settle. That's when I saw him, on the south leaf, peering over the top edge of the roadway, right where my ladder was resting. A hand appeared, a gray, slimy hand gripping the steel edge. Then a face. It wasn't Miller, it was another one, a slick wearing a mechanic's coverall. It pulled itself up onto the tip of the bridge. It saw me. It saw the ladder. It tilted its head like a curious dog. Then it reached out a hand toward the end of my ladder, the end that was resting on only 6 inches of steel. It wasn't going to attack me. It was going to push the ladder off. "No!" I screamed. I fumbled for the flare gun. My gloves were too thick. I couldn't get it out of the pouch fast enough. The slick's fingers touched the aluminum rail. It smiled, a split lip, gum-bleeding smile. It shoved. The ladder shifted. Scrape. 4 inches of overlap left. I lunged forward. I abandoned caution. I scrambled on all fours like a desperate animal. The slick shoved again. 2 inches. I was 5 feet away. I threw myself. I launched my body off the ladder, diving through the air just as the aluminum slid off the edge. I felt the ladder fall away beneath my boots. I hit the wet asphalt of the south leaf chest first. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I slid backwards toward the gap. My hand scrabbled for a grip.
I found a scupper drain hole. I hooked my fingers into it. I jerked to a halt. My legs were dangling over the edge. I watched the ladder tumble end over end, silently falling into the mist below. I looked up. The slick was standing over me. It looked down at my fingers gripping the drain. It raised a heavy, work-booted foot. It was going to stomp my hand.
A 12-gauge marine flare doesn't explode like a gunshot. It ignites. It burns at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a handheld supernova designed to be seen from 10 miles away in a hurricane. At a distance of 3 feet, it isn't a signal, it's a thermal lance. I didn't aim. I just shoved the orange muzzle toward the shape looming over me and pulled the trigger. Whoosh! The recoil snapped my wrist back against the asphalt. A blinding sphere of red light erupted between us. The slick didn't have time to process the threat. The flare hit him center mass, embedding itself in the thick, gray mucus layers of his coveralls. The reaction was immediate and horrific. The weep, that translucent fungal coating, isn't just water. It's biological oil. It sizzled. The slick threw its head back and let out a sound that wasn't human. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a steam valve bursting. He stumbled backward, clawing at his chest, his hands passing through the fire. The light was so intense I had to squeeze my eyes shut. I felt the weight leave my hand. He hadn't stomped me. He was too busy burning. I scrambled. I kicked my legs, finding purchase on the scupper drain, and hauled myself up over the lip of the bridge deck. I rolled onto the wet asphalt, gasping for air, the heat of the flare warming my back. I scrambled 10 feet up the slope, away from the edge before I dared to look back. The slick was gone. He had fallen. Whether he slipped or threw himself off to douse the flames, I didn't know. I saw a streak of red light tumbling down into the black abyss below, sputtering out as it hit the river. I was alone on the south leaf. I sat there on the steep incline, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I checked my gear. The ladder was gone, the bridge back to my tower was gone. I was stranded on the enemy side of the river, perched on a 70-degree slope of steel and asphalt. The only way out was down, into the south tower, into Miller's domain. The descent down the south leaf was different than the climb up the north one. The physics were the same, gravity trying to peel me off the road, but the environment had changed. My tower, the north tower, was sterile. I had kept it clean. Here, the bridge deck was fertile. As I crawled down, digging my screw-spiked boots into the asphalt, I noticed the texture of the asphalt. It wasn't just wet. It was carpeted in a thin, velvet-like moss. Black veins pulsed in the rainwater runoff. I passed a car, a red compact sedan wedged against the railing. I shined my flashlight inside. It wasn't empty. It was full, not with people, but with growth. The interior was a dense, gray web of fungal matter. It looked like someone had filled the cabin with expanding foam, but the foam was breathing. A hand, human, skeletal, blue, protruded from the mass, pressing against the glass as if asking for a high five. I kept moving. Don't look at the details, look at the objective. I reached the bottom of the raised span. The transition from the bridge deck to the fixed pier was tricky. I had to swing over the gap where the counterweights swing. I landed on the south pier catwalk. The smell hit me instantly. Even through my N95 mask, even through the smell of the storm, it was overpowering. It smelled like a swamp in high summer. Rot, musk, stagnant water. I stood before the door to the South Tower control house. On my side, the door was steel, painted industrial gray, locked tight. Here, the door was open, or rather, it was blocked open. A thick slurry of debris, driftwood, seaweed, and that gray biological matter had wedged it ajar. I drew the flare gun. I broke the barrel, ejected the spent shell. It clattered loudly on the grate, and loaded a fresh round. 3 left. I stepped inside. The South Tower was a dark mirror of my home. The layout was identical. The console desk, the breaker panels, the kitchenette. But where my tower was a fortress of solitude, this was a hive. The windows weren't just dirty, they were coated on the inside with a translucent film like a cataract. The floor was slick with an inch of standing water, and it was warm, disturbingly warm. The air was thick and humid, fogging my safety glasses. I wiped them with a gloved thumb. "Miller?" I whispered. Something moved in the corner, near the breaker panel. I swung the flare gun. "Don't shoot, Silas. Fire consumes oxygen. We need the oxygen." The voice came from the operator's chair. I turned the beam of my light toward the desk. Miller was sitting there, but he wasn't wearing a headset. He wasn't checking logs. He was integrated. The weep had colonized him. His Bridge Authority uniform was shredded, the fabric fused with his skin. His legs were indistinguishable from the chair legs, wrapped in thick, ropey tendrils of gray fungus that trailed off across the floor and into the electrical conduit. But his face was relatively clear. Pale, wet, eyes milky white, but clear. He was looking at me with an expression of profound pity. "You look dry, Silas," Miller gurgled. "It looks painful being that dry. Your skin is cracking." "I'm fine, Miller," I said, keeping the distance. "I'm just here for the fuel valve. Where is it?" Miller smiled. His gums were gray. "The fuel. You want to run the machine. You want to keep the lights on. You want to deny the water." "I want to live," I said, "and I can't live if the generator dies." "Living is changing," Miller said. He gestured, a stiff, jerky movement of his hand at the monitors. They were all dead except one. The screen showed a view of the river below. "Look at the water, Silas. It's not death. It's a network. We are all connected now. The slicks on the bridge, they're not lost. They're just waiting for the signal." "What signal?" "The flood," Miller said softly. "The tide is rising. When it reaches the deck level, we won't need the bridge to cross. We will swim. We will flow into the mainland. But you are a stone in the river. You are an obstruction." I took a step toward the machinery room door. The valve controls for the transfer pump were down there, next to the south side generator. "Don't," Miller said. His voice dropped an octave, losing the pity and gaining a hard, metallic edge. "The pump is offline. We disabled it. The noise, it disrupts the song." "I'm turning it back on," I said. Miller didn't stand up. He couldn't stand up. But he did something worse. He opened his mouth wide, unhinging his jaw like a snake, and let out a sound. It was a high-frequency shriek, not loud, but piercing. It vibrated in my teeth. Behind me, in the shadows of the stairwell I had just entered, I heard movement, wet, slapping footsteps. He was calling the guards. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't fight a horde in a confined space. I had to get to the machinery room, lock the door, and open the valve. I ran. I sprinted past Miller. He swiped at me with a hand that looked more like a claw, his fingernails elongated and black. He caught my tool belt, ripping a pouch loose, but I tore free. I hit the machinery room door. It wasn't blocked. I threw it open, dove inside, and slammed it shut. Bang. I threw the deadbolt. A second later, a heavy body slammed against the other side, then another. They were scratching at the steel, a frantic, rhythmic scraping. I was in the south machinery room. It was dark, lit only by the red service lights on the equipment. The air here was heavy with diesel fumes and rot. I scanned the room. There it was, the transfer pump assembly, a complex array of pipes and valves painted safety yellow. I rushed to it. The manual override wheel, a large red iron wheel, was chained shut. Miller had wrapped a heavy industrial chain through the spokes and padlocked it. "Damn it," I hissed. I checked my tool bag. I had a bolt cutters. No, I had left the heavy tools in the north tower to save weight for the climb. I had the flare gun. I had a utility knife. I had a screwdriver. And I had the flare gun. I looked at the padlock. It was a laminated steel master lock, tough but not invincible. I looked at the flare gun. Magnesium burns at 3,000 degrees. Steel melts at 2,500. It was a gamble. If I melted the lock, I might melt the valve stem. If I melted the valve stem, the pump would seize and I'd be dead in 3 days. But the door behind me was bowing inward. The hinges were groaning. Miller's choir was trying to break in. I had no choice. I pressed the muzzle of the flare gun against the body of the padlock. I turned my head away. Whoosh! The heat was instantaneous. Molten metal sprayed onto the concrete floor. The smoke was acrid, choking me even through the mask. I held the trigger until the flare sputtered out. I looked at the lock. It was a glowing, slagged lump of metal. I grabbed the pipe wrench from the wall mount, thank God for redundant tool stations, and smashed the glowing lock. Crack! The chain fell away. I grabbed the red wheel. It was hot from the conduction, burning my gloves, but I hauled on it. Creak, groan. The valve turned. 1 rotation, 2. I heard the hiss of pressure equalizing in the lines. I found the electrical starter box for the pump. I hit the green button. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Whirr. The pump kicked on. It was loud, a beautiful mechanical roar that drowned out the scratching at the door. I watched the pressure gauge. The needle climbed. 10 psi, 20 psi, 40 psi. Fuel was flowing. It was pushing diesel through the pipe under the river back to my sanctuary in the North Tower. I slumped against the pipe, laughing a jagged, hysterical laugh. I had done it. I had bought myself time. But then the realization hit me. I had sent the fuel back to the North Tower, but I was still in the South Tower. The door to the machinery room was buckling. The steel was warping under the relentless assault of the slicks outside. They knew I was in here. They knew I had turned the machine back on. I looked for an exit. The machinery room on this side had a secondary door, an emergency egress that led to the lower maintenance platform, down near the water level. I ran to it. I spun the wheel. It opened. I stepped out onto the lower grating. The wind was vicious down here, screaming through the bridge piers. I was 20 feet above the black water. I looked up. The ladder I had used to cross the gap at the top was gone. The slicks controlled the control house in the upper deck. I looked across the river. My tower, the North Tower, stood silent and dark, waiting for the fuel to hit the tank. In a few minutes, the lights over there would kick on automatically. It would be warm. It would be dry. It would be safe. And I was on the wrong side of the river. I was trapped on the South Pier, surrounded by the infected, with no way to cross back. Wait. I looked at the water. The current was ripping past the concrete pilings, but running parallel to the bridge, about 50 feet downstream, was the utility cable catenary. Thick bundles of power lines sagging across the river. They were coated in ice. They were swaying in the storm, but they connected the 2 piers. I looked back at the door I had just exited. A slick, the one I had burned? No, another one, burst through the doorway, stumbling into the storm. It saw me. It hissed. I climbed over the railing. I wasn't going to swim. I was going to wire walk. I unclipped my safety harness. The static line I had was 50 feet. The gap was 200. I looked at the cables. Don't look down, I said to myself. Just don't look down. I stepped out under the thick black cable bundle. It was slick with slime and rain. It swayed under my weight. I was halfway between the piers when the generator in the North Tower, my tower, suddenly roared to life. The lights in my glass box across the river blazed on, a beacon of safety in the dark. I stared at it, mesmerized. And then I felt the cable I was standing on vibrate, not from the wind. I looked back at the South Pier. Miller was standing on the lower grating. He had dragged himself down there. He was holding a fire axe. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the anchor point of the cables I was standing on. He raised the axe. "Cut the connection!" he screamed over the wind. "Let it flow!" Physics is usually predictable. Action, reaction, force, mass, acceleration. But when a 2-inch diameter steel utility cable under 10 tons of tension snaps, physics stops being a calculation and becomes a violent, chaotic event. I saw the axe hit. I saw the sparks, and then the world dissolved into a blur of motion. The cable bundle didn't just fall, it whipped. The tension released from the South Pier anchor converted instantly into kinetic energy. Because I was standing at the midpoint of the sag, I became the weight at the end of a very long, very fast pendulum. I didn't have time to scream. I barely had time to grip the icy insulation of the power lines with my thighs and arms. The cable dropped. The stomach-turning sensation of freefall hit me, that zero-G moment where your organs float into your throat. I fell maybe 40 feet in a second, swinging down toward the black water. The wind roared in my ears. The spray from the river hit my face like buckshot. And then the swing reached its nadir and started to arc up toward the North Pier, my home. The concrete wall of the bridge support rushed at me out of the darkness. "Brace!" my brain screamed. I turned my shoulder. I tucked my chin. Wham! I hit the concrete piling. It wasn't a graceful landing. I slammed into the wet, slime-coated concrete with the force of a car crash. The breath exploded out of my lungs. My ribs groaned under the impact. My helmet, thank God for the construction helmet, cracked against the wall with a sickening plastic crunch. I bounced off, dangling over the water. The cable was now hanging vertically from the North Pier anchor point, twisting and spinning in the wind. I was clinging to it like a tick, about 20 feet above the surface of the Black River. I looked down. The water was churning directly below my boots, and it wasn't empty. The noise of the cable snapping and my impact had drawn them. Slicks were surfacing, pale, bloated faces bobbing in the current, looking up at me, hands reaching out of the sludge. They couldn't reach me, but the spray from their thrashing was misting my boots. The weep, the infection is in the water. If that spray got into a cut, into my eyes, or into my mouth, the clock would start ticking. I squeezed my eyes shut, gasping for air through my N95 mask, praying the seal had held during the impact. My arms were screaming. The lactic acid burn was immediate. I was holding onto a greasy, wet cable with gloves that were losing their grip. I had to climb. The North Pier is a sheer cliff of concrete, but 50 feet up, where the cables enter the structure, there is a service hatch, a small steel maintenance door used for inspecting the utility runs. I looked up. The cable disappeared into the gloom above. 50 feet. "Move," I wheezed. "Move or die." I kicked my right boot into the cable. The screws I had drilled into the sole bit into the rubber insulation. Thunk. I kicked the left boot. Thunk. I hauled myself up 6 inches, then another 6. It was an agonizing inchworm progress. The cable was spinning slowly, disorienting me. The wind battered me against the concrete wall every few seconds, scraping my knuckles raw. Climb, rest, breathe, climb. 20 feet up, the sound of the river faded slightly, replaced by the howl of the wind through the bridge truss. 30 feet up, my grip was failing. My fingers were cramping into claws. I had to hook my elbows over the cable to keep from sliding down. 40 feet up, I could see the service hatch. It was a square outline in the concrete, rusted and covered in lichen. It was closed. Panic flared. Of course it was closed. It's an exterior hatch. I reached it. I wrapped my legs around the cable, locking my ankles to free up my hands. I leaned back, swaying over the abyss, and grabbed the handle of the hatch. It was a wheel latch, rusted solid. I pulled. It didn't budge. I pounded on it with my fist. "Open! Damn you, open!" Nothing. I looked down. The drop was lethal. I looked across the river. The Miller Tower was dark, but I knew Miller was there, watching, maybe laughing that wet, gurgling laugh. I couldn't go back. I couldn't stay here. I reached for my tool belt. The pouch was ripped where Miller had grabbed me, but my hammer was still in its loop, a heavy 20-ounce framing hammer. I grabbed it. I swung at the latch handle. Clang! Sparks flew. I hit it again and again, violent, desperate strikes. I wasn't trying to turn it. I was trying to break the rust seal. Clang! The handle moved a fraction of an inch. I hooked the claw of the hammer into the wheel spokes and pulled with everything I had left. I put my feet against the concrete wall for leverage. I screamed into my mask, pouring every ounce of fear and rage into the torque. Screech! The metal shrieked. The wheel turned. The hatch popped open, swinging outward.
A blast of warm, dry air hit my face. It smelled of diesel exhaust and dust. It was the smell of the machine, the smell of home. I scrambled inside. I practically fell into the utility crawl space, dragging my legs in and kicking the hatch shut behind me. I spun the wheel from the inside, locking it. I lay on the metal grating of the crawl space, shivering uncontrollably. I was safe. I was inside the North Pier.
Recovery was slow. I lay there for 10 minutes, just letting my heart rate come down from stroke levels. The crawl space runs alongside the main power conduits. I could hear the hum of electricity in the heavy cables next to me. The fuel line, the pipe I had activated from the other side, was gurgling steadily. The pump was working. The diesel was flowing to my generator. I wasn't just alive. I had won. But victory in the apocalypse is never clean. I sat up and turned on my flashlight. I looked at my gear. My Tyvek suit was shredded. The knees were gone, torn away by the climb. My elbows were exposed. My skin was wet. Not just sweat, the spray from the river, the rain, the slime from the cable. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the exhaustion. I had to decontaminate, now. I scrambled up the internal service ladder, moving as fast as my battered body would allow. I emerged into the machinery room of the North Tower. The lights were on. The generator was humming a steady, beautiful rhythm. I ran up the stairs to the control house. I locked the heavy steel door behind me. I stripped. I tore the boots off, throwing them into the corner. I peeled the shredded Tyvek suit off, careful not to let the outside touch my skin. But it was too late for perfect protocol. My pants were soaked. My shirt was damp. I stood naked in the center of the glass box, shivering. I grabbed the spray bottle of bleach solution. I sprayed myself everywhere. It burned. The bleach hit the raw scrapes on my knuckles and the bruises on my ribs, stinging like fire. I didn't care. I rubbed it in until my skin turned red. I scrubbed my face. I scrubbed my hair. I rinsed with the precious bottled water, letting it pool on the floor, then bleached the floor. I put on fresh clothes, my last clean uniform. I sat in the operator's chair and wrapped myself in a wool blanket. I waited. The incubation period for the weep varies. If you drink it, you turn in hours. If it gets in a cut, maybe a day. If it's just skin contact, nobody knows for sure. I checked my hands. No gray spots, no numbness. I checked my eyes in the reflection of the monitor. No milky film. I was clean, for now. I looked at the console. The fuel gauge for the day tank was climbing. 85%, 90%. The lights were steady. The heater was pumping warm air. The humidity sensor read 45%. I was secure. But the silence was different now. Before, the silence was lonely. Now, it was expectant. I looked out the window across the river. The south tower was dark. The storm had swallowed it again. But I knew what was over there. I had seen the hive. I had seen Miller integrated into the chair, the fungal network growing out of his legs. I had seen the slicks working together to push a ladder. They weren't just animals. They were building something. Miller had said, "The tide is rising." I grabbed the binoculars and looked down at the river gauge painted on the pier piling. The water level was higher than yesterday, 6 inches higher. The storm wasn't stopping. The drainage systems were completely failed. The river was backing up. If the water rose another 20 feet, it would breach the lower machinery rooms. If it rose 50 feet, it would hit the road deck. Miller was right. Eventually, the bridge wouldn't be a barrier. It would be a reef. I needed a new plan. Sitting in the tower and waiting for the water to recede wasn't survival anymore. It was just a slow death. I needed to fortify. I needed to weaponize the bridge. I looked at the control levers for the span. The bridge weighs 3,000 tons per leaf. It has massive crushing power. It has height. It has electricity. I wasn't just a bridge tender anymore. I was the captain of a stationary warship. I keyed the radio mic.
I didn't know if Miller was listening. I didn't care. "Miller," I said, my voice raspy but steady, "I know you can hear me. You kept the power lines intact on your side because you need the grid connection if the main feed comes back. You didn't cut everything." Static. Then a faint, wet click. He was listening. "I have the fuel," I said. "I have the high ground, and I have the controls. If you send any more of your climbers up here, I won't just use a flare gun. I'll drop the span. I'll crush anything on that pier flat." No answer. I said, "Stay on your side. This is my bridge." I released the button. I leaned back in the chair. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. My ribs throbbed with every heartbeat. I closed my eyes for a second. Tap, tap, tap. I opened them. The sound came from the glass window facing the catwalk. I turned my head slowly. It wasn't a slick. It was a moth. A large gray moth fluttering against the glass, drawn to the light of my monitors. It landed on the pane. Its wings were patterned with intricate, swirling designs. I leaned closer. The pattern on the wings wasn't random. It looked like eyes, milky white eyes. And the moth, it left a greasy gray smear on the glass where it touched. The infection wasn't just in the water anymore. It was taking flight. I watched the moth batter itself against the glass, leaving smear after smear, trying to get in, trying to get to the warmth. I reached out and turned off the monitor, plunging the room into darkness. The moth stopped tapping. I sat in the dark, listening to the rain, listening to the generator, and realizing that the siege had entered a new phase. The water was rising, the enemy was evolving, and I was the only thing standing between the city and the mainland.
This is Silas Vance, operator of the Iron Point. The fuel is flowing, the bridge holds, but the weep is changing. If anyone is listening, get to high ground, and if you see the rain turn gray, don't let it touch you. End of log.